Storm. Ororo Munroe is Storm, African goddess and superpowered mutant. She's a natural leader with a royal ancestry, with the wind, rain, and lightning hers to command. She has been a mainstay of the X-Men since Charles Xavier brought her into the team, even defeating Cyclops once in a leadership fight. Over the years, she has not only led the X-Men, but also the Morlocks and the XSE, the Extreme Special Executive. Let's take a closer look at her origins and life. Cairo street urchin, tribal goddess, mutant superhero, X-Men leader, and commander of a subterranean street gang. Still relatively young, the phases of Storm's life are as tempestuous and changeable as the weather she can induce, and she provides an object lesson that it's a rum old world, and you should never take your circumstances for granted. It's possible a Kenyan princess and an American photojournalist could get together in the real world, but unlikely. In the comics, though, the infant Ororo Munroe lived in Cairo, the daughter of Ender and David Munroe. Presciently enough, her given forename meant beauty, and with her regal and artistic heritage, a comfortable life seemed a certainty. But then, as we all know, planes crashing into buildings tend to disrupt certainties. Being buried beneath the rubble beside her mother's corpse left Ororo with a lifelong terror of confined spaces. Egyptian social services left something to be desired, but Ororo proved an extremely adaptable 6-year-old, surviving the grubby streets of Cairo. She made her home with Ahmed El-Jabbar, who maintained his hospitality toward her and her fellow street urchins as long as they continued to thieve for him. Among Ororo's victims was her future mentor and X-Men founder, Charles Xavier, whose pocket she adroitly picked. He was the first to recognize her as gifted with mutant abilities, but was distracted by a psychic attack from elsewhere before he could investigate the young Ororo's powers. Spending 6 years as a Cairo pickpocket and thief, Ororo yearned for upward mobility. Never bereft of character or fearing a challenge, she set off across the Sahara Desert to her mother's homeland. Her mutant ability to control the weather manifested with puberty en route. She discovered she was able to transform the weather to her will, and her journey was rendered considerably simpler by virtue of being able to control the winds with a degree of finesse that enabled her to fly. She descended from the skies on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro, and the witnesses began to worship her as a goddess. By her next encounter with Charles Xavier, she struck an imposing figure, a naked native goddess with long, flowing white hair. Mutants, meaning no more to her than Pez dispensers, pet rocks, or the Partridge Family, she'd come to believe the role of tribal provider that had been thrust upon her. Petitioned with offerings of food at a specially constructed portal, she would mould the weather for the purposes of the petitioners. Not a bad life if you can wangle it. Under her care, the local tribes of the Serengeti remained unaffected by the periods of drought and subsequent famine afflicting other sparsely vegetated areas of Africa. Charles Xavier changed her life. He telepathically revealed that her abilities stemmed from mutant genes rather than being the natural attributes of a celestial being. The complacency generated by having her every need provided for was washed away by a new challenge, and Ororo agreed to be part of a new team of X-Men required to rescue their predecessors. Despite being attuned with nature and intimidated by enclosed spaces, Ororo elected to remain in her father's homeland. Named Storm to reflect her abilities, she honed them in the company of her fellow new X-Men under Xavier's tutelage. It was ascertained that Storm's powers were linked to her emotions. Her anger physically manifested through dark skies, thunder and lightning, while stealing her yogurt from the fridge produced less dramatic results. Despite her traumatic childhood, Storm is essentially a serene, if somewhat aloof person with a great love of nature. Shorthand, she's Greta Garbo crossed with Charlie Dimmock. Her years of naturally being deferred to, her wide experience of life, and her adaptability made her a confident X-Men team leader when the position was offered. A decisive combatant, she seemed equally at home in the depths of space, combating alien races, dinosaurs in prehistoric lands, mysteriously concealed within Antarctica, or run-of-the-mill mutant villains. She will go to pieces, mind, in landslides and cave-ins, not to mention when 10 tons of machinery with a conveniently placed hollow has been dumped on her by Magneto. A turning point for Storm came when she first encountered the Morlocks. Remaining anonymous among humanity wasn't an option for the Morlocks, whose mutant powers came with deformities and grossly distinct appearances. They formed their own protective society in the sewers and tunnels beneath New York, structured in the manner of street gangs where the toughest fighter leads. Despite lacking an eye, Callisto whooped every butt offered. The only way the X-Men were going to free a kidnapped comrade was if one of them took on Callisto in a fight to the death. As X-Men leader, Storm considered this her responsibility, and overcame being bombarded with waves of nausea by a Morlock named Plague to emerge victorious, stabbing Callisto in the heart. The extent of Storm's cunning was apparent here. She avoided breaching the X-Men code forbidding the taking of life by correctly calculating that a Morlock named Healer would restore Callisto to health. This despite his seeming inability to restore her missing eye. Storm took her new responsibility as Morlock leader seriously, offering the community shelter in the X-Men's Westchester headquarters. But when they declined, she appointed Callisto as Morlock leader in her absence. This was a transitional period for Storm, who was uncommonly plagued by overwritten doubts about her career, her methods, and inner turmoil. She began to believe effective X-Men leadership required jettisoning previous beliefs and adopting a greater brutality. During a subsequent trip to Japan, exposure to the free-spirited adventure Yukio led to Storm reconciling her inner demons by adopting a new look. The long-haired goddess in spandex was replaced by a leather-clad punk, complete with Mohican cut on an otherwise shaved head. It's a common belief among women that makeovers work wonders, and in this instance it washed away the restraint Storm had unconsciously applied to her powers. No longer did sustained bursts of weather manipulation leave her exhausted. It's speculated that Storm's weather-controlling abilities are psionic in nature. Her mind is finely attuned to barometric conditions, and this enables her to alter levels of temperature, control the amount of moisture in the air, and generate the storms from which she takes her name. Her control over these powers is so fine that she is able to create localized effects otherwise spread over much wider areas, such as miniature rainstorms over her potted plants. She has also been known to shoot bolts of lightning from her hands, and she has been measured flying at speeds in the hundreds of miles per hour, her body automatically adjusting to the stresses this causes. At the height of her game, top of the world and queen of the heap, Storm lost her powers completely when she flew into the path of a weapon designed to remove the abilities of her colleague, Rogue. Not even another makeover could restore them. Storm fell into the arms of cyborg soldier, shaman, scientist, and altogether Renaissance straitjacket, Forge. Forge's devising of the weapon that rendered her powerless put pay to that intimacy, but the sincerity of his feelings were demonstrated by his devising the mean to restore Storm's powers. They were reconciled over the course of time, and Forge even proposed marriage, but withdrew his proposal on realizing Storm's priority would always be her career. It's a testament to Storm's skills as a combatant that even bereft of her powers, she was able to defeat Cyclops during a challenge to determine who should lead the X-Men. Storm's next major trauma was her capture by the cyborg Nanny and her henchman Orphan Maker. Nanny was nothing if not a thorough planner, and placed a Storm life model decoy within the X-Men to coincide with Ororo's abduction. When the replacement was killed, the X-Men believed Storm dead, so they made no attempts to track her down. Storm was regressed to a prepubescent state, a transformation that also suppressed her memories. Still possessed of her prepubescent skills, though, she escaped her captors, and prompted by vague recollections, she travelled to Cairo. Unfortunately, she picked the version in Illinois. Surviving on her wits, as she had done previously as a child, she became a latter-day Robin Hood, stealing from criminals to supply the needy. Here she teamed with adult mutant Gambit, and when Nanny in turn captured him, Storm's memory was conveniently restored. She effected a rescue, and the pair returned to the X-Men's mansion. With mutants persecuted throughout the Marvel Earth, the East African island of Genosha offering a haven should have been an ideal sanctuary. That is, if its ruler hadn't been a despot who enslaved the indigenous mutants and kidnapped others to serve under him. Storm was among them. His downfall was supplying another makeover. Storm's head was shaved, and her identity was stripped, the mutates being known only by the numbers tattooed on their foreheads. And wouldn't you know it, that makeover magic worked again. A side effect of the genetic code injected into Storm restored her to full adulthood. With full command over her abilities, she freed the other mutants and escaped Genosha. While her childhood experiences in Cairo were far from ideal, Storm acknowledged that without the patronage of the rogue Ahmed El-Jabbar, she may not have survived to become an adult. When she learned he was dying, she considered a debt required paying, and took the time to visit him. Although never altruistic, he continued to protect Cairo's orphans, and wished his work perpetuated. Before dying, he appointed another mutant, Karima, to lead his group. After she had prevented another mutant named Kandra from killing Storm, Kandra's enmity stemmed from a claim to the ruby jewels Storm wore as part of her costume for many years. Storm had stolen the gem from a museum as a child, but was unaware of its origins with the murderous telekinetic Kandra. El-Jabbar's concern for his orphans was mirrored by Storm's continued watchful eye over the Morlocks. It seemed at one time, though, that they had been massacred, by a group of mercenaries known as the Marauders, and Storm believed them all perished. Incredibly, though, some in fact survived, transported to another dimension where time passed at a faster rate. Bonus. Here a young Morlock named Marrow grew to adulthood, possessed of the stomach-turning ability to grow extra bones through her skin, detach them, and use them as weapons. Wasting no time on returning to Earth, Marrow formed a terrorist group called Gene Nation, and proved a formidable foe for Storm, who only defeated her by ripping out her heart. But it was okay. She had to. Calmed down by this, she reconsidered her allegiances, but her time among the X-Men was one of unease for Storm. As the number of X-Men grew, so did Storm evaluate her position as both a team member and member of the larger and increasing population of mutants. She came to the conclusion that while she agreed with the principle of mutants and humanity coexisting peacefully, this required more than concealing and training mutants within the confines of a remote school in New York State. The matter of Destiny's diaries caused a temporary fracture between Storm and many of her teammates. An incredibly powerful blind precognitive with an accuracy rate of 100%, throughout her life, Destiny wrote detailed but cryptic premonitions, and occasionally attempted to act in order to prevent what she foresaw, never succeeding. On her death, some volumes of her writings were discovered to be missing, and it was presumed these books revealed the final fate of both humanity and mutants. Storm considered it a priority to locate these volumes, and so, covertly, recruited a cadre of X-Men to do so. Luckily, Storm's X-Men managed what Destiny had never been able to do. They circumvented a prophecy. In this case, the team member Rogue would kill a particular enemy. Having proved the diaries were not infallible, the initial impetus passed. Philosophical differences remained with the main X-Men, though, and Storm's squad continued to operate independently in the short term, before rejoining in the aftermath of Magneto's most recent attempt at global domination. Her differences with them resolved. Along the way, in a sequence eerily reminiscent of her early acquisition of leadership of the Morlocks, Storm triumphs over a society exploiting mutants by making them battle. Once again, she deputizes Callisto to take control. Well, everyone should have a second chance. Storm is currently a mainstream X-Man within the extreme special executive unit of the team, given official sanction to protect humanity from rogue mutants. In her very first appearance in Giant Size X-Men 1, writer Len Wein left no doubt in the reader as to how awed one should feel about Storm. This woman commands the elements. She shapes to her will the very air you breathe. The reader immediately grasps this X-Men's member's powers. She was an Earth goddess in more than one sense. Primal forces are at Ororo Munroe's beck and call. She calls for a storm, and a storm comes. Although by nature Ororo is usually a serene personality, beneath the calm surface waters, however, there is a passionate and sensual woman, whose history informs the development of her great powers. Her real Achilles heel is her severe claustrophobia. Her control over local weather patterns emerged in puberty, and the teenage Ororo quite literally existed as a goddess of the weather. Her weather-controlling abilities are psionic, and are closely linked to her emotions. Hence, those aforementioned passions must be kept in careful check, hence the dignified serenity. If she's feeling angry or unhappy, storm clouds can gather. She watches herself carefully, of course, and is able to exert an extremely tight focus over her abilities. On a large scale, Storm's influence over weather patterns is exactly that. She affects and stimulates rather than creates. Her mutant ability allows her to enhance and manipulate local weather conditions, not call them up from nowhere as a magical entity such as Thor can. Of course, her ability is so finely attuned to the weather that a normal human being, that the effect looks like magic. That said, she draws her sudden weather furies and great winds from the raw stuff of the neighborhood weather, perceiving the local atmosphere's humidity and precipitation, its air movement and cloud cover as patterns of energy to which she reaches out and becomes one with. Storm is also able to disperse and calm naturally occurring weather patterns. If these are of large size and intensity, however, this can require extreme effort from her and can be exhausted. One time, she was required to calm a Canadian snowstorm of gargantuan proportions that had been called into being by a member of Alpha Flight. This time, she actually tapped into the electrical potential of the Earth itself, channeling the great storm's power through her own body and diffusing its fury across the entire continent of North America. When Storm lost all her powers, it was her strength, determination, and self-belief that saw her through, with a little support from the X-Team that she led. Today she is a woman of yet greater repose, regal but never too aloof, with that surface tranquility always ready to give way, if necessary, to the roar of the storm. Truly a goddess.